His fiancée attacked a maid at the gala, unaware she was a Black Belt Grandmaster. Hey, stop scrolling for a second. At 34 years old, Nathan Cole had already built an empire. Glass towers, private jets, more money than most people could count in a lifetime. But nothing he owned could have prepared him for what happened on the night of his engagement gala. Because when his fiancée grabbed a maid by the arm in front of 300 guests, she had no idea who she was really touching. By the time the chandelier lights caught her breath, one woman in that room was about to learn a lesson she would never forget. Welcome back, friends. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing this community stretch across the world. Tonight's story is about pride, humiliation, and what happens when you underestimate someone because of the uniform they're wearing. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Nobody at that gala knew the real reason Renee Carter never raised her voice. The Cole family estate sat on 11 acres overlooking the Rhode Island coastline, a white stone mansion with a ballroom built for exactly nights like this one. Gold light poured down from a chandelier the size of a small car. 300 guests moved beneath it in tuxedos and gowns, champagne flutes catching the glow, laughter rising and falling like music of its own. Tonight, Nathan Cole was getting engaged, and half of New England's old money had shown up to watch it happen. Nathan was 34 years old, and he had built his fortune the hard way. He didn't inherit the Cole name's wealth. His grandfather had left the family with more debt than dignity. Nathan built it back himself, starting with a single logistics company he ran out of a rented garage in his 20s, growing it into a shipping and real estate empire that now stretched across 4 states. He was the kind of man magazines liked to photograph. Broad-shouldered, quiet, more comfortable in a warehouse than a ballroom. But tonight he wore the tuxedo well, because tonight, in front of everyone who mattered, he was going to ask Bianca Sinclair to marry him. Bianca was 32, stunning in a way that stopped conversations, and she knew it. She had grown up 2 towns over from the Coles, the daughter of a hedge fund manager who had taught her, without ever saying it out loud, that appearances were currency. She dressed like she was already the lady of the house. She spoke to waiters like furniture. And most people who met her assumed that was just how beautiful, wealthy women behaved, a little sharp around the edges, but harmless. Nathan didn't see it that way. He was in love, and love has a way of smoothing out the parts of a person you'd rather not look at too closely. Renee Carter had been hired 3 weeks earlier through the catering agency the Coles used for large events. She was 33, soft-spoken, with steady hands and an even steadier way of moving through a crowded room without disturbing a single conversation. The other staff liked her immediately. She showed up early, stayed late, and never once complained about the 12-hour shifts these events demanded. What nobody noticed, because nobody ever really looks at the people refilling their glasses, was the way Renee's eyes tracked exits. The way she stood with her weight balanced evenly on both feet, even when she was standing still. The calm in her shoulders that looked, to anyone who knew what they were looking at, less like tiredness and more like discipline. Renee had a life before this one. A life she didn't talk about at work, because it belonged to a version of herself she had quietly set down 5 years ago. But some things don't leave a person, no matter how far they travel from them. Some things live in the body long after the mind has moved on. Tonight, she was simply staff. Table 14 was hers, a group of the Coles' oldest family friends, seated closest to the small stage where Nathan planned to make his announcement. She refilled water glasses, cleared empty plates, smiled politely when spoken to and said nothing when she wasn't. It was, by every measure, an ordinary night. Bianca noticed her around 9 o'clock. It started small. Bianca had asked for her wine glass refreshed twice already and felt, in the particular way people like her feel things, that she was being ignored. She wasn't. Renee had simply been managing 4 other tables at once, but perception was Bianca's whole world, and in her perception, this was a slight. She watched Renee move past table 14 without stopping, and something small and ugly tightened behind her ribs. "She's doing it on purpose," Bianca murmured to the woman beside her, a longtime family friend named Carol who had known the Sinclairs for 20 years. Look at her. She's slow. Carol, who had drunk enough champagne to find everything mildly funny, just shrugged. She's fine, honey. It's a big party. Bianca didn't answer. She kept watching. Across the room, Nathan was deep in conversation with his business partner, going over the timing of the announcement one more time, unaware that the woman he was about to propose to had fixed her attention on a maid carrying a tray of dessert plates. He had no idea that in less than an hour everything about this night, the one he'd planned for months, the one meant to be the happiest of his life, was about to become something else entirely. Renee reached table 14 again just after 10, balancing a tray of chocolate torte with the kind of ease that came from years of practice, though not the kind of practice anyone at that party would have guessed. As she leaned in to set a plate down in front of Bianca, her sleeve brushed the edge of a wine glass. It didn't spill. It didn't even wobble much. But Bianca's hand shot out and closed around Renee's wrist before the glass had even settled. "Do you have any idea," Bianca said, low enough that only the nearest few heard it, but loud enough that Renee felt every word, "how much this dress cost?" Renee didn't pull away. She didn't apologize either, not yet. She simply looked at the hand wrapped around her wrist, then up at Bianca's face, with an expression that wasn't fear, and wasn't quite calm either. It was something closer to recognition. Like she was watching a storm she'd seen coming from a long way off finally arrive. "I'm sorry," Renee said quietly. "It didn't spill. I'll be more careful." But Bianca's grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened. 300 guests were still laughing, still drinking, still completely unaware that at table 14, something had just been set in motion that none of them would forget. Nathan was 40 feet away, smiling at something his business partner had said, one hand already in his jacket pocket where a small velvet box waited. He had no idea his fiancée's fingers were digging into a maid's wrist. He had no idea that Maid had once been called, by people who knew what the words meant, a grandmaster. And he had no idea that in the next 60 seconds, his entire engagement night was about to collide with a part of Renee Carter's past that she had promised herself she would never have to use again. Nobody in that ballroom understood how close they were to witnessing something impossible. Renee tried to step back, gently pulling her wrist toward herself, the way she'd been trained a lifetime ago to disengage before anything became a problem. Please," she said quietly. "Let go of my arm." But Bianca didn't let go. If anything, the calmness in Renee's voice made her angrier. Bianca had spent her whole life reading people's reactions as either fear or defiance, and Renee's steadiness registered to her as the second one. In Bianca's world, staff who didn't flinch were staff who needed to be taught a lesson. "Excuse me." Bianca's voice rose half an octave, sharp enough that Carol beside her stopped mid-sip. "Did you just tell me what to do?" "No, I just asked you to let go." A few heads at the neighboring tables turned. Not many. Most of the room was still absorbed in its own conversations, its own champagne, its own small dramas, but enough. Enough that a ripple of attention started moving outward from table 14 like a stone dropped in still water. Bianca stood up from her chair, and the movement was too fast, too sudden for a woman in a floor-length gown who'd had 3 glasses of wine. She still had Renee's wrist. Renee, for her part, remained still, not frozen, not frightened, but deliberately still, the way a person stays still when they are choosing not to do something rather than being unable to do it. "You people," Bianca said, and the word landed heavier than she seemed to realize. "Come into rooms like this and act like you belong here. Like you're not just here to serve." Renee's jaw tightened, just barely. Something flickered behind her eyes, not anger exactly, but an old, familiar ache, the kind that comes from hearing an insult you've heard in different words 100 times before. She thought, for one brief second, about her mother. About the diner she'd grown up working in as a kid, about the years of dojo mats and broken knuckles and every teacher who'd told her that real strength was never about proving a point. "I understand you're upset," Renee said, low and even. "But you're hurting my arm." "Good," Bianca snapped. And then she pulled. It happened fast, faster than anyone expected from a woman in 6-inch heels holding a wine glass in her other hand. Bianca yanked Renee's arm hard enough that the tray in Renee's other hand tipped, dessert plate sliding, a wine glass on the table crashing to the floor and shattering across the marble. Renee's balance broke for half a second, not because she couldn't hold it, but because catching herself meant not catching the tray, and she chose, instinctively, not to let food and glass rain down on the guests around her. She went down toward the table, one hand catching the edge to stop herself from falling fully, her shoulder twisting under Bianca's grip. For anyone watching, it looked exactly like what it was, a much larger, much angrier woman forcing a smaller woman down by the arm in front of 300 people. The room shifted. Conversations stopped in waves, spreading outward from the center like a held breath. Someone gasped. A photographer near the stage, there to capture candid engagement shots, instinctively lifted his camera before he even understood why. Carol stood up, hand over her mouth, whispering Bianca's name like a warning that came a half-second too late. "Bianca," a man's voice called out, Nathan's business partner, Marcus, who had turned at the sound of breaking glass and now stood frozen, unsure whether to move. Across the ballroom, Nathan heard his fiancée's name shouted in alarm, and every muscle in his body turned toward the sound before his mind had caught up with what he was hearing. He excused himself mid-sentence and started walking, then moving faster, weaving between tables, his heart already sinking with a dread he couldn't name yet. At table 14, Renee was bent slightly forward, one hand braced on the white tablecloth, wine soaking into the fabric beside an overturned plate of chocolate torte. Bianca still had her wrist. And something in Renee's posture had changed, subtle, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. Her weight had shifted onto the balls of her feet. Her shoulders had dropped low and loose. Her breathing had slowed. It was the stillness of a person deciding, in real time, whether to let something happen to her, or to stop pretending it couldn't. "Let go of me," Renee said again, and this time there was something different underneath the words. Not a plea. A warning. Bianca, drunk on wine and humiliation and an audience she hadn't quite registered yet, didn't hear it as a warning. She heard it as more defiance. Her grip tightened one more time, nails digging into skin, and she raised her free hand, the one still holding the wine glass, as if she meant to throw what remained of it in Renee's face. Gasps rippled through the crowd now, unmistakable, guests half rising from their seats. Someone called out, "Hey, stop." A young waiter froze mid-step, tray trembling in his hands. Carol grabbed for Bianca's arm and missed. And for one suspended second, the entire gala seemed to hold its breath at once. 300 people watching a woman in red silk loom over Maid bent across a dinner table, glass shattered at their feet, gold chandelier light spilling down over all of it like something out of a nightmare dressed up as a fairy tale. Nathan was still 30 feet away, pushing through the crowd, close enough now to see his fiancée's raised hand, close enough to shout her name, but not close enough to stop what was about to happen next. Because in that frozen second, Renee Carter made a decision she'd promised herself, 5 years ago, that she would never have to make again. Nobody expected the maid to move like that. Time didn't slow down for Renee the way people describe in movies. It sped up, clean, precise, the way it always had in the dojo, the way her body remembered how to move before her mind gave it permission. Bianca's hand came down, wine glass tilting, the last of the red wine arcing toward Renee's face. Renee's hand rose to meet it. Not a slap, not a punch, nothing that would have looked violent on a camera. Just a simple, practiced redirection, her palm catching Bianca's wrist mid-motion and guiding it sideways, off its path, the same way you gently steer a door that was about to slam. The wine glass slipped from Bianca's fingers and shattered on the floor instead of Renee's face. And then, in the same fluid motion, Renee turned her own captured wrist, the one Bianca still gripped, in a slow, controlled rotation. It looked, to the 300 people now staring, like nothing at all. No punch. No kick. No violence anyone could point to on a phone camera later and call an attack. Just a small, precise twist of Renee's forearm, and suddenly it was Bianca's hand that couldn't hold on anymore, Bianca's fingers that peeled open on their own, Bianca's balance that tipped backward half a step as her grip broke clean. For one full second, nobody in the ballroom moved. Bianca stood there, hand empty, staring at her own fingers like they belonged to someone else. The pain wasn't dramatic. Renee had made sure of that, had controlled every ounce of force in the motion the way she'd been trained to for over 20 years, but it was enough. Enough to make Bianca's face crumple from fury into confusion into something closer to fear. "What?" Bianca started, her voice cracking. "What did you just?" She didn't finish the sentence. She lunged instead, humiliation curdling into something uglier, her hand swinging toward Renee's face in a wild motion that had no training behind it at all, just raw anger looking for somewhere to land. Renee didn't step back. She stepped in. It happened in under 2 seconds. Renee caught the swing at the wrist, turned her hip, and used Bianca's own momentum to fold her arm gently behind her back. Not violently, not designed to hurt, but designed, with absolute precision, to make it physically impossible for Bianca to move without hurting herself first. Bianca gasped, bent slightly forward at the waist, immobilized by a technique so clean and so controlled that half the room didn't even register it as self-defense. It looked, for a strange, suspended moment, almost like a dance. "I'm not going to hurt you," Renee said, quiet enough that only the people closest could hear it, her voice steady in a way that made the words feel more chilling than comforting. "But you need to stop." Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, an older man in a dark suit, a retired judge who had once sat ringside at an international martial arts exhibition 11 years earlier, went very still, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. He was staring at Renee's stance, at the exact angle of her elbow, at the impossible economy of every motion she'd just made. Something in his memory clicked into place, slow and disbelieving. "My God," he murmured to his wife. "I know her. I know that technique. That's..." He didn't finish either, because at that exact moment, Nathan broke through the last of the crowd and saw his fiancée bent forward at the waist, locked behind her back, held in place by a maid he'd exchanged maybe 10 words with all night. "Bianca." Nathan's voice cracked across the ballroom, sharp with panic. "What's going on? Let her go right now." Renee heard him. She looked up, found his eyes across the small, stunned circle of guests, and in that look, something passed between them that neither of them could have explained in words. Not guilt. Not defiance. Something closer to an apology for what he was about to learn, about his fiancée, and about her. Slowly, deliberately, Renee released Bianca's arm. Bianca staggered upright, cradling her wrist, mascara smudged where tears of shock and fury had started without her permission. "She attacked me," Bianca said, breathless, pointing a shaking finger at Renee. "Nathan, she attacked me, do something." Nathan's eyes moved from his fiancée to the maid standing perfectly calm amid shattered glass and spilled wine, and back again. Around them, 300 guests stood frozen in various states of shock, phones half raised, the Gala's string quartet trailing off into silence as the musicians, too, turned to stare. And then the retired judge's voice cut through the quiet, loud enough now for half the room to hear. "That's not an attacker," he said slowly, setting down his glass. "That's Renee Carter." Nathan turned toward him, confused. "You know her?" The old man nodded, his expression somewhere between astonishment and reverence. "Everyone in the martial arts world knows her, son. Or they did, before she disappeared." He looked back at Renee with something close to awe. "She's a grandmaster. 6-time national champion. I watched her fight in Denver 11 years ago. She broke a world record nobody's touched since." A murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave. Nathan stared at Renee, really looked at her, maybe for the first time all night, and felt the ground shift beneath the evening he'd so carefully planned. Because standing in front of him wasn't just a woman who'd been attacked by his fiancée. It was a woman with an entire life he knew nothing about. A woman who had just, without raising her voice or throwing a single punch, revealed more about Bianca's character in 10 seconds than 2 years of dating ever had. And somewhere in his jacket pocket, the velvet ring box suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute, though it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. The old judge's words hung in the air: Grandmaster, 6-time national champion, world record, and the ballroom seemed to reassemble itself around them, 300 guests recalculating everything they'd just watched. The woman they'd assumed was staff, the woman Bianca had grabbed like she was nothing, was not nothing at all. She was something most of them had only ever seen on television, in documentaries about sports nobody in this room had ever needed to understand. Bianca was still holding her wrist, but her expression had shifted from fury to something more complicated. Humiliation mixed with disbelief mixed with the dawning, horrible awareness that every person at this party had just watched her lose, decisively and publicly, to a woman she'd assumed she could push around. "That's not possible," Bianca said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier force. She's staff. She's serving tables." "I am staff," Renee said quietly, and there was no anger in it, just a tired kind of honesty. "Tonight, that's exactly what I am." Nathan stood between the two women, his tuxedo jacket suddenly feeling too tight, his mind trying to process a dozen things at once: the shattered glass at his feet, the ring box in his pocket, the way his fiancée's face had looked when she raised that wine glass, and the strange, quiet dignity of the woman who'd stopped her from throwing it. He thought about the version of tonight he'd rehearsed in his head for weeks. It had ended with Bianca crying happy tears and 300 people applauding. It had not included any of this. "Bianca," he said slowly, "what happened? What did you do? What did I do?" Bianca's voice cracked upward, indignant. "Nathan, she spilled wine on my dress. She was rude to me all night. I was handling it, and she attacked." "I didn't attack anyone," Renee interrupted, still calm, still even, though something in her tone had firmed up. "You grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise it. I asked you 3 times to let go. You didn't. Then you threw a glass of wine at my face, and I stopped it from landing. That's all that happened." Marcus, Nathan's business partner, had made his way over by now, along with a small cluster of guests who'd gone from onlookers to something closer to witnesses, several of them nodding slowly at Renee's account, confirming with small gestures and murmured agreement that yes, that was what they'd seen too. Nathan looked down at Bianca's wrist, red-marked but not seriously hurt, and then at the shattered wine glass, the ruined tablecloth, the small crowd of guests who would all remember this night regardless of what he said next. He thought about his grandmother, long past now, who used to tell him that you learn everything you need to know about a person by watching how they treat someone who can't do anything for them. He had believed her his whole life without ever really being tested on it. He was being tested on it now, in front of everyone he knew. "You threw a drink at her," Nathan said slowly, like he was working out the words as he spoke them, "because she spilled a little wine." "Nathan, don't take her side." "I'm not taking sides, Bianca, I'm asking you what happened." His voice was quiet but it carried, the way voices do when a room has gone silent enough to hear itself breathe. "You grabbed a woman by the wrist hard enough to bruise it, in front of everyone, at our engagement party. Is that true?" Bianca's mouth opened, then closed. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. "She was disrespectful," Bianca finally said, quieter now, aware that the room's sympathy, what little of it remained, was slipping further away with every second. "You don't understand what it's like. People like her, they see people like us, and they think they can just." "People like her," Nathan repeated, and something in his face had gone very still, very careful, the way it did in boardrooms right before he made a decision he wouldn't take back. "Bianca, stop talking." She stopped. Renee, for her part, had bent down and was quietly gathering the broken glass from the floor with a folded napkin, out of old habit more than obligation, the way a person does when chaos surrounds them and their hands need something honest to do. A young waiter rushed over to help her, kneeling beside her, whispering something that made her offer him a small, tired smile. The judge who'd recognized her approached slowly, his wife beside him, and knelt slightly to speak to Renee directly, his voice gentle. "Ms. Carter, I don't mean to intrude. But I have to say, watching you tonight, after all these years, it's an honor. What happened to you, after Denver? You just disappeared." Renee straightened, glass shards wrapped safely in the napkin, and for the first time all evening, something in her composure wavered. Not much, just a flicker, quickly smoothed over. "Life happened," she said simply. "That's all." It wasn't all, and everyone close enough to hear the way she said it understood that. But she didn't offer more, and the old judge, sensing the boundary, didn't push. Nathan watched this exchange, watched a stranger speak to Renee with more reverence in 30 seconds than he'd managed in 3 weeks of walking past her at events, watched Renee deflect a question about her own past with the same quiet control she'd used to deflect Bianca's wine glass, and felt something shift permanently inside his understanding of the night. He turned back to Bianca. The Gala photographer had lowered his camera. The string quartet had not resumed playing. 300 guests were still watching, waiting to see what the man at the center of all of it would do next. "I need a minute," Nathan said quietly, not to Bianca, not to Renee, but to the room in general, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man who'd spent a career keeping his composure in front of people watching for cracks. "Everyone, please, enjoy the evening. I'm sorry for the disruption." But as the string quartet hesitantly picked their instruments back up, and conversation slowly, awkwardly resumed around the edges of the ballroom, Nathan didn't return to his fiancée's side. He walked instead toward Renee, who was handing the wrapped glass shards to the young waiter, and for the first time all night, he really looked at her, not as staff, not as an inconvenience to be smoothed over, but as a person whose life, he was only now beginning to understand, was far larger and far heavier than anything he'd imagined when he'd walked past her tray of champagne glasses 3 hours earlier. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Renee glanced at her wrist, faint red marks already forming into what would become a bruise by morning. "I'll be fine," she said. "I've had worse." Something about the way she said it, simple, unbothered, carrying the weight of experiences she clearly wasn't going to explain to a stranger at a party, made Nathan understand, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, just how little he actually knew about the people his money and his name moved past every single day. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what she did. For all of it." Renee met his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. Behind them, Bianca stood alone at table 14, mascara smudged, wrist reddened, watching her fiancé apologize to a maid in front of everyone who mattered to their future, and understanding, with a cold, sinking certainty, that whatever she'd imagined tonight would become, it was never going to be that again. Nobody at that gala knew the real story behind Renee Carter's 5-year disappearance from the world that once celebrated her. The party had resumed around them in fits and starts, conversation returning in careful, quieter tones, waitstaff sweeping up the last of the glass, the string quartet playing something soft and forgettable to smooth over the awkwardness. But the energy of the room had changed permanently. The way a house feels different after a storm even once the windows are repaired. Guests kept glancing toward table 14. Toward Nathan, standing near a woman in a caterer's uniform. Toward Bianca, alone, arms crossed, refusing to look at anyone. Nathan guided Renee gently toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the estate's dark gardens, away from the curious eyes still tracking them. "You don't have to talk to me," he said. "I know this isn't, I know I'm not owed an explanation. But I'd like to understand what happened tonight. All of it." Renee studied him for a moment, weighing something. In her experience, men who looked like Nathan, expensive suits, careful manners, the kind of face that got doors opened for it, rarely asked questions like that and actually meant them. But something in his eyes seemed genuinely unsettled, genuinely trying to make sense of a night that had cracked open in front of him. "There's not much to explain," she said finally. "I used to compete. I stopped. Now I work catering jobs 3 nights a week and clean office buildings the other 4. That's it. That's the whole story." The judge called you a grandmaster. 6-time national champion. That's not nothing, Renee. Hearing her name in his mouth, not Miss just her name, plain and human, seemed to loosen something in her, just slightly. She glanced out at the dark garden, at the shape of hedges she couldn't fully make out, and let out a breath that had been held, in some form, for longer than one evening. I started training when I was 6, she said. My mother worked 2 jobs to pay for lessons because a boy in my building had been giving me trouble, and she wanted me to be able to protect myself. Turned out I was good at it. Really good. By 16 I was competing nationally. By 23 I'd won my first world title. She paused. By 28 I had 6 national championships, 3 world titles, and a shot at something bigger than all of it, the Olympic exhibition circuit, sponsorship deals, a training academy with my name on the door. Everything I'd worked for since I was a kid. What happened? Renee's jaw tightened, just barely. My younger brother, Marcus, got sick. Kidney failure. He needed a transplant, and even with a match, which took 2 years to find, the surgery and the recovery and the medication after cost more than my mother could ever earn, more than my winnings could cover once I factored in what training actually cost. I had a choice. Keep training, keep competing, keep chasing the career I'd spent my whole life building, or step away, take work that paid steady and immediate, and be there for my family when they needed me. She said it plainly, without self-pity, the way people describe decisions they've made peace with only through years of repetition. I chose my brother. I don't regret it. But it meant walking away from everything I'd built in that world, almost overnight. Sponsors dropped me within a month. The academy deal fell through. And once you're gone from that world for a year, you're gone. Nobody waits. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of what she'd just told him. A story that made his own life, the one built on inherited struggle turned self-made success, feel suddenly smaller in comparison. He'd built a shipping empire out of a garage. She'd built a legacy out of nothing and then set it down, without hesitation, the moment someone she loved needed her more than the world needed her talent. Is your brother? He's fine now, Renee said, and for the first time that night, something like warmth broke through her composure. Healthy. Married. Works as a mechanic in Providence. He doesn't know I still think about it sometimes. The training, the competitions, all of it. He'd feel guilty if he knew, and he shouldn't. I made my choice. I'd make it again. But you still train. It wasn't a question. Nathan had watched what happened at table 14. Whatever Renee had walked away from, her body clearly hadn't forgotten it. Every morning, she admitted. Before my shifts. It's not for anyone anymore. It's mine. The one thing that's still mine. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression had shifted from shock into something closer to respect, maybe even shame at how easily this entire evening could have gone differently. How easily he could have spent months, years even, standing next to a woman who devalued people like Renee without him ever noticing, if tonight hadn't cracked the surface wide open. I need to ask you something, he said slowly. And I need you to be honest with me. Renee waited. Has Bianca done anything like this before? Not exactly this, I mean, has she treated people this way before, and I just didn't see it? The question hung between them, heavier than anything else said that night. Renee considered her answer carefully, aware of what it might cost the man in front of her, aware that whatever she said next might reshape the rest of his life. I don't know your fiancée, she said finally. I only met her 3 hours ago. But I've worked events like this for 2 years, Nathan. I've served hundreds of parties, hundreds of people like the ones in this room tonight. She met his eyes directly. Most of them never once look at the person refilling their glass. That's not cruelty. That's just how it is. But there's a difference between not noticing someone and grabbing them hard enough to bruise because they made a mistake that cost you nothing. One of those is inattention. The other is something else. Nathan absorbed this in silence, the noise of the party fading into background static as he stood there, turning over every interaction he'd witnessed between Bianca and waitstaff, drivers, assistants, over the 2 years they'd been together. Moments he'd dismissed at the time as simply Bianca being particular, being stressed, having a bad day. He was beginning to see a pattern he'd never let himself look at directly. Behind them, across the ballroom, Bianca had noticed the two of them talking. Really talking, heads close, the conversation stretching far longer than any apology required, and something cold and desperate settled into her chest. She began walking toward them, heels clicking against marble, her face arranged into the practiced expression of a woman about to fight for something she was terrified she'd already lost. "Nathan," she called out, closing the distance. "Can we talk? Alone?" Nathan turned toward her, and for the first time in 2 years of their relationship, his expression held something Bianca had never seen directed at her before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clear-eyed distance, as if he were looking at her from much further away than he'd ever stood. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think we need to." Nobody in the ballroom pretended not to watch as Nathan and Bianca walked toward the side terrace together, though most had the decency to lower their voices and angle their bodies away, offering the illusion of privacy even as every ear strained to catch what might come next. The terrace overlooked the dark sweep of the estate's back gardens, string lights strung along the stone railing, the noise of the party muffled behind glass doors that Nathan pulled shut behind them. Out here, the air was cooler, quieter, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching long enough that Bianca finally broke it herself. "Before you say anything," she said, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild evening air, "I want you to know I didn't mean for it to go that far. It was a bad night. I had too much wine. I overreacted." "You grabbed her hard enough to bruise her wrist, Bianca. Then you threw a glass at her face." "I didn't throw it at her face, I was gesturing, and it slipped." "Don't." Nathan's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a finality that stopped her mid-sentence. "I watched you do it. So did 300 other people. Please don't stand here and tell me I didn't see what I saw." Bianca's composure cracked slightly, the practiced defensiveness giving way to something rawer underneath. She looked down at her hands, at the faint red mark still visible on her own wrist where Renee's grip had held her in place. "You don't understand what tonight was supposed to be," she said, quieter now. "This was supposed to be the biggest night of my life. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting for you to propose, and instead I'm standing out here explaining why I lost my temper at a waitress. This isn't about the party, Bianca. Isn't it?" Her voice cracked upward, some of the old fire returning. "You don't know what it's like, Nathan. You grew up with nothing and built everything yourself, and everyone admires you for it, the self-made man, the underdog story. But I grew up watching my mother claw her way into rooms like that one tonight, watching her get looked down on by women who'd married into money instead of earning it, watching her fight for every ounce of respect she got. I promised myself I'd never be looked at that way. I'd never be the person people didn't take seriously." Nathan was quiet for a moment, absorbing this, some small part of him understanding the shape of the fear underneath her words even as he rejected what it had produced. "So because you were afraid of being looked down on," he said slowly, "you decided the answer was to look down on someone else first." Bianca flinched like he'd struck her. That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Nathan pressed, and there was something almost pleading in his voice now, a man desperately wanting an explanation that would let him keep believing in the future he'd planned. "Because from where I stood, it looked exactly like that. You didn't see a person who made a small mistake. You saw someone you decided you could treat however you wanted, because of what she does for a living. And the second she pushed back, even a little, you tried to throw a drink in her face in front of everyone we know." Bianca's eyes filled, tears spilling over before she could stop them, mascara streaking down toward her jaw. "I know how it looked," she said. "I know. But you have to believe I'm not a bad person, Nathan. I panicked. I embarrassed myself and I panicked and I made it worse instead of better. I do believe you panicked, Nathan said, and his voice had softened slightly, though nothing about his expression had. But panic doesn't explain the first part. Panic doesn't explain grabbing her wrist hard enough to bruise it, or the things you said to her before any of that happened. I heard you, Bianca. You people. I heard exactly what you said. The silence that followed was long and terrible. Bianca had no answer for that one, no deflection sturdy enough to survive it, and for the first time all night, she seemed to understand that this wasn't a conversation she could win with tears or wounded pride. What do you want me to say? She finally whispered. I don't want you to say anything right now, Nathan said. I want to understand something. 2 years, Bianca. 2 years we've been together, and I never once saw this side of you. Was it always there, and I just wasn't paying attention? Or did something happen tonight that brought out something new? It was, in some ways, the kindest question he could have asked her, an offering of doubt, a door left open just slightly. But Bianca's answer, when it came, closed that door for good. Does it matter? She said, wiping angrily at her eyes. Either way, I did it. Either way, you're standing here looking at me like I'm someone you don't recognize. It matters to me, Nathan said quietly. Because I need to know if I've been building a life with someone I actually know, or someone who's been very good at showing me only the parts she wanted me to see. Bianca didn't answer that. She couldn't, because some small, honest part of her recognized the truth buried inside his question. Recognized that the version of herself she'd presented to Nathan for 2 years had always been carefully curated, softened, adjusted for an audience she badly wanted to keep. The Bianca who'd grabbed Renee's wrist tonight wasn't a stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. She was the Bianca who existed underneath all the careful adjustments, the one who came out when she thought no one important was watching closely enough to matter. Through the glass doors behind them, the party continued in its awkward, muted way, guests pretending not to glance toward the terrace every few minutes, waiting to see how the night's central drama would resolve. Somewhere inside, Renee had returned quietly to her duties, refilling water glasses at tables far from 14, moving through the room with the same steady composure she'd carried all evening. Though anyone looking closely might have noticed her attention drift, every so often, toward the terrace doors. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and felt the small velvet box still sitting there, exactly where it had been for the past 3 hours, waiting for a moment that suddenly felt impossibly far away. I need some time, he said finally. Tonight, and probably longer than tonight. I can't stand up in front of everyone we know and propose to you an hour after watching what I watched. Bianca's face crumpled. Nathan. I'm not ending things right now, he said, before she could spiral further. I'm telling you I need time. And I need you to think, really think, about why tonight happened the way it did. Not the version where you panicked. The real version. He turned back toward the glass doors, toward the golden light and the murmur of 300 guests waiting to see what would happen next, and left Bianca standing alone on the terrace with the string lights and the quiet dark gardens and the terrible, sinking understanding that whatever future she'd imagined for herself in that mansion was no longer guaranteed. Nobody expected the Gala's photographer to be the one who almost changed everything. Inside, Nathan pushed through the terrace doors and stood for a moment blinking in the ballroom's golden light, the noise and motion of the party rushing back around him like water closing over his head. 300 guests were doing their best impression of normal conversation, but the room still hummed with the particular electricity of an event that had turned, unexpectedly, into a story people would tell for years. He caught fragments of it as he walked, hushed voices repeating Grandmaster, did you see that? I heard she broke some kind of record, and felt a fresh wave of unease settle over him. This wasn't just his and Bianca's problem anymore. It belonged to the room now. He found Marcus near the bar, nursing a scotch he clearly hadn't touched, watching him approach with the careful expression of a longtime friend trying to read a situation before speaking into it. You good? Marcus asked quietly. No, Nathan admitted. Where's the photographer? Marcus's face shifted. Danny. He's around somewhere. Why? Because I need to know if he got pictures of what happened at table 14. It was the kind of question Nathan hated having to ask, not because he cared about his own image, not really, but because the answer would determine how much of tonight's mess would exist outside this room, outside his control, ready to surface online with captions written by strangers who understood nothing about the people in the photographs. He found Danny near the stage, quietly reviewing shots on the back of his camera, and the young photographer's face went carefully neutral the moment he saw Nathan approaching. Mr. Cole. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to. Show me what you have. Danny turned the camera screen toward him, and Nathan scrolled through a dozen images in silence. Bianca's hand locked around Renee's wrist, the wine glass midfall, Renee's calm, controlled block, the moment Bianca's arm folded gently but unmistakably behind her back. Each photograph told the story with brutal clarity, no context needed, no captions required. Any one of them, posted publicly, would follow Bianca for years. Would follow him, too, by extension. The fiancé who stood by while it happened, at least until the very end. Delete them, Nathan said quietly. Danny hesitated. Sir, I don't think. I'm not asking you to lie about what happened. I'm asking you not to profit off the worst 30 seconds of someone's life becoming entertainment for strangers on the internet. Nathan's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, not quite mercy for Bianca, more a kind of principle he needed to hold onto for his own sake. This isn't about protecting her reputation. It's about not turning a woman's public humiliation into content. Danny glanced at Marcus, who gave a small nod, and after a long moment, deleted the photos one by one while Nathan watched, the small chime of each deletion oddly loud in the noise of the party. It wouldn't stop every phone in that room from having captured something. He knew that, realistically, some version of tonight would find its way online regardless of what he did here, but it was something. A small act of restraint in a night that had otherwise spiraled entirely outside anyone's control. He found Renee again near the kitchen doors, quietly directing two younger staff members through the cleanup of an unrelated spill, her manner so composed, so entirely professional, that a stranger walking in now would never have guessed what she'd done 20 minutes earlier. Can I talk to you for a second? Nathan asked. Renee glanced up, and something careful entered her expression. The practiced wariness of someone who had learned, likely from hard experience, that being singled out by the host of an event rarely led anywhere good, even when the host meant well. Of course, Mr. Cole. Nathan, he corrected gently. Please. She allowed a small nod, though she didn't relax the way he'd hoped. I should apologize, she said before he could speak further. I embarrassed you tonight. I know that wasn't your fault, but it's your event, and I made a scene in the middle of it. You didn't make a scene, Nathan said, something sharp entering his voice at the unfairness of it. You defended yourself after someone attacked you at a party you were working, not attending. If anyone owes an apology, it's not you. Renee studied him for a moment, as if recalibrating something. Most people in your position wouldn't see it that way. Most people in my position grew up with money, Nathan said. I didn't. I know what it's like to be looked through instead of at. I spent 5 years driving a delivery truck before I could afford to start my own company, and I remember exactly how it felt when people looked at my uniform instead of my face. He paused. I'm not saying that to compare what happened to you tonight to anything I went through. I'm saying I recognized what I was looking at, once I actually looked. Something in Renee's posture eased, just slightly, not trust exactly, not yet, but the loosening of a guard that had been up all evening. That's rare, she said. People who've made it usually forget. I try not to. Nathan glanced back toward the ballroom, where the party continued its uneasy rhythm, guests clustering in small groups, conversation still occasionally dipping toward whispers whenever someone glanced their way. I wanted to ask, and please say no if this isn't something you want, but I run a foundation through my company. Youth outreach programs, mostly in underserved neighborhoods around Providence. We've been looking for someone to help develop a self-defense and confidence program for teenage girls, something beyond the standard curriculum. I think you'd be extraordinary at it, if it's something you'd ever consider. Renee blinked, caught off guard in a way that nothing else that evening had managed to catch her. You're offering me a job. 20 minutes after your fiancé attacked me at your engagement party. I'm offering you something that has nothing to do with tonight, Nathan said. I'd have offered it to you regardless, if I'd known who you were 3 hours ago. Tonight just happened to be when I found out. Renee was quiet for a long moment, studying his face for the insincerity she'd learned, through years of experience, to expect from people who suddenly discovered a use for her after ignoring her value for months. She didn't find it. What she found instead was something closer to genuine recognition, a man re-evaluating, in real time, everything he thought he knew about the people who moved invisibly through his life. I'll think about it, she said finally, which from Renee, given everything the night had already asked of her, was as close to yes as she was willing to offer just yet. Across the ballroom, unnoticed by either of them, Bianca had re-entered through the terrace doors, mascara repaired, composure rebuilt into something brittle and thin, and stood watching Nathan and Renee speak with an ease that felt, to her, like watching her entire future quietly slip away in real time. Nobody in that ballroom expected Bianca to cross the room a second time, but grief and panic rarely wait for permission. She found Nathan and Renee still standing near the kitchen doors, their conversation quiet, unhurried, the kind of exchange that made Bianca's stomach twist with a jealousy she didn't fully understand herself. She'd spent 2 years being the center of Nathan's attention. Watching him look at someone else, even briefly, even for reasons that had nothing to do with romance, felt like watching a door close somewhere she couldn't see. Nathan, she said, her voice smaller now than it had been on the terrace. Can we please finish talking? Alone. Renee excused herself immediately, offering no argument, no lingering glance, simply stepping back into her work with the same quiet professionalism she'd carried all night. Nathan watched her go before turning back to Bianca, and something in his face told her, before he'd said a single word, that the terrace conversation hadn't actually ended, it had only paused. I don't think there's anything left to say tonight, he said. There has to be. Bianca's composure, rebuilt so carefully in the bathroom mirror 20 minutes earlier, was already cracking again. Nathan, we've been together 2 years. You were about to propose. Are you really going to throw that away because of one bad moment? It wasn't one moment, Nathan said, and though his voice stayed gentle, there was no give in it. It was one moment that showed me something that's probably always been there. That's different, Bianca, and I think somewhere underneath all of this, you know that too. Bianca's eyes filled again, and this time she didn't bother wiping the tears away. You don't understand what it's like to grow up feeling small, she said, her voice breaking. My whole life, I watched my mother get overlooked in rooms exactly like this one. I promised myself I'd never let anyone make me feel that way. And somewhere along the way, I think I decided the only way to make sure of that was to make sure other people felt smaller than me first. It was, unexpectedly, the most honest thing she'd said all night, and Nathan felt the weight of it, felt something in him soften slightly even as his resolve held firm. I believe that's true, he said quietly. I believe that's really what's underneath tonight. But Bianca, that's not an excuse. That's a wound you need to deal with, in real work, with real help, not something you get to take out on people who can't defend themselves. He paused. Except tonight, as it turns out, she could. Bianca let out a small, broken laugh at that, despite everything, and for a moment something almost like the woman Nathan had fallen for 2 years ago flickered back into her expression. Self-aware, a little wry, capable of laughing at her own catastrophe even while it was happening. I don't want to lose you, she said. I know I don't deserve to say that right now. But it's true. I don't think you're losing me because of who I am, Nathan said carefully. I think tonight showed both of us who you are, underneath the version I fell in love with. And I think if we're honest, some part of you has known that version was there for a long time. I just wasn't paying close enough attention to see it. Around them, the party had begun its slow, awkward unwinding. Guests making early exits with murmured excuses, valets called ahead of schedule, the string quartet packing away their instruments an hour before they were meant to. Nobody needed to be told the engagement wasn't happening tonight. The absence of an announcement had become its own kind of announcement. Bianca's parents found her near the entrance an hour later, her father's face carefully neutral in the way of men who'd spent decades in boardrooms learning not to show their hand, her mother's arm slipping around her daughter's shoulders with the practiced comfort of someone who'd smoothed over crises before. Whatever words passed between them stayed private, murmured near the coat check as the last guests filtered out into the cool night. Nathan didn't watch her leave. He stood instead near the terrace doors, looking out at the dark garden, turning the small velvet box over in his jacket pocket without taking it out. He thought about the past 2 years, dinners, trips, quiet mornings that had felt, at the time, like the beginning of a whole life. He thought about how easy it had been to miss the parts of Bianca that didn't get shown to him directly. And he thought, with a discomfort he couldn't quite shake, about how many other things in his life he might be missing simply because no one had ever forced him to look closely enough. By midnight, the ballroom had nearly emptied. Staff moved through in quiet efficiency, clearing tables, folding linens, dimming the chandelier's 1,000 small lights one section at a time. Renee worked among them, her sleeves rolled up, her earlier composure fully restored, as if the night's chaos belonged to someone else entirely. Nathan found her stacking chairs near table 14, the same table where everything had started, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the ballroom quiet enough now to hear the soft clink of glassware being packed away in the next room. "She's gone," he said simply. "Her parents took her home." Renee nodded, saying nothing, understanding instinctively that this wasn't a moment that needed her opinion. "I meant what I said earlier," Nathan continued. "About the foundation. About the program. I know tonight was a lot, and I don't want you to feel like you have to say yes just because of how it ended. But the offer's real, whenever you're ready to think about it." Renee looked at him for a long moment, at the exhaustion in his face, the quiet integrity underneath it, the strange, unplanned honesty of a night that had stripped away every careful arrangement either of them had walked in with. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Why does it matter to you?" "My answer, I mean. You could hire anyone for that program. Why does it matter whether it's me?" Nathan considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things that actually mattered to him. "Because you didn't have to be as controlled as you were tonight," he said finally. "You could have hurt her. Really hurt her, if you'd wanted to. Instead you did exactly what was necessary and nothing more, even while she was trying to humiliate you in front of everyone I know. That's not just skill, Renee. That's character. And I don't think that's something you can teach, I think it's something you either have, or you don't." Renee didn't answer right away. She finished stacking the last chair, straightened, and looked at him with an expression that held, for the first time all night, something unguarded. "I'll come by the foundation office Monday," she said. "We can talk details." It wasn't a large moment, not compared to everything that had already happened that night, but it felt, to both of them, like the first true beginning of something neither had planned for when the evening started. Nobody expected the sound of a training program's opening day to bring an entire community out onto a run-down gymnasium floor, but 3 months later, that's exactly what happened. The gymnasium sat in a converted warehouse on the edge of Providence, part of a neighborhood the Cole Foundation had quietly invested in for years, funding after-school meals and tutoring and job placement programs that never made headlines because Nathan had never wanted them to. This new addition, a self-defense and confidence program for teenage girls, built from the ground up under Renee's direction, had taken 12 weeks to plan and furnish, and today, on a bright Saturday morning in late October, its doors opened for the first time. Renee stood at the center of the mat in workout clothes instead of a catering uniform, her posture the same steady, grounded presence it had always been, except now there was nothing hidden underneath it. 22 girls, ages 11 to 16, sat cross-legged in a loose semicircle around her, some nervous, some skeptical, a few visibly excited, all of them there because a flyer at their school or community center had promised something most of them had never been offered before: the chance to learn, from someone who actually understood, how to take up space in a world that too often told them not to. "My name is Renee Carter," she told them, and her voice carried easily across the gym without needing to be raised. "Some of you might have heard I used to compete. That's true. But that's not really why I'm here. I'm here because a long time ago, someone believed I deserved to feel strong in my own body, and it changed my whole life. I want to give you that same chance." At the back of the gym, leaning against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets, Nathan watched the session begin, feeling something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with business or investment returns. A quiet satisfaction in watching something good take shape from something that had started, 3 months earlier, as one of the worst nights of his life. The months since the gala had reshaped more than just his understanding of Bianca. The engagement had ended formally within 2 weeks, both families managing the separation with as much grace as wounded pride allowed, though word of what happened at the party had, inevitably, made its way through their social circle regardless of the deleted photographs. Bianca had left the state not long after, moving to stay with an aunt in Chicago, and Nathan had heard, secondhand, that she'd started therapy. A small, hopeful detail he chose to believe rather than question. He and Renee, in the meantime, had built something neither of them had expected when he'd first offered her the foundation job. It started professionally: planning sessions, budget meetings, long conversations about curriculum and outreach that ran later into the evening than either of them planned. Slowly, almost without either of them naming it, those conversations had started drifting past the boundaries of work. Coffee after meetings. A dinner that wasn't officially a dinner. A comfortable quiet that neither of them felt the need to fill with small talk. Neither had rushed it. Renee, especially, had been careful. She'd spent 5 years building a life entirely on her own terms, and she wasn't interested in becoming anyone's rebound, or anyone's charity case, or anyone's story about redemption that centered someone else's arc instead of her own. Nathan understood this without needing it explained, and the patience he showed, never pushing, never assuming, simply being present and consistent in a way few people in her life had ever managed to be, was, more than anything else, what had slowly earned her trust. Her brother had been the first to notice something had shifted. He'd driven up from Providence one weekend, taken one look at the careful way Renee mentioned Nathan's name in casual conversation, and grinned so widely she'd had to leave the room. "It's not like that," she'd told him, unconvincingly. He hadn't believed her, and by the 3rd or 4th mention over the following weeks, neither had she. Her mother, meeting Nathan for the first time at a small dinner in November, had studied him for a long, careful moment across the table before saying simply, "You're the one who apologized to my daughter in front of 300 people instead of asking her to keep quiet about it." It wasn't quite a compliment, not yet, but it was the beginning of one, and Nathan had understood exactly what kind of test he'd just passed. Back in the gymnasium, the first session was drawing to a close, 22 girls now standing in loose rows, practicing the same simple wrist release Renee had used on Bianca 3 months earlier. A technique so quiet and precise it barely looked like anything at all, right up until the moment it worked. Renee moved between them, correcting angles, offering encouragement, her voice warm in a way it had rarely been allowed to be during her years of quiet, careful work at other people's parties. "You don't have to be the loudest person in the room," she told them, as the session wound down. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just have to know, in your body, that you can protect what's yours, your space, your voice, your safety. That knowledge is enough. It'll change how you walk into every room for the rest of your life." One of the younger girls, maybe 12, raised her hand. "Were you scared? When it actually happened to you, for real, not practice?" Renee considered the question honestly, aware that half the room was suddenly listening more closely, aware too that Nathan, still watching from the doorway, had gone still. "I wasn't scared," she said finally. "I was tired. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of being invisible to people who thought that gave them permission to treat me carelessly. But that tiredness is exactly what training gives you. The ability to stay calm even when you're tired of being pushed. Calm is more powerful than angry. It always will be. The girl nodded slowly, absorbing this in the serious way children do when they've just been told something true by someone they've decided to trust. Around her, the rest of the group began gathering their things. The first session officially over, 22 new stories quietly beginning in a gymnasium that, 3 months earlier, had been an empty warehouse nobody thought much about. Nathan waited until the last of the girls had been picked up by parents and guardians before crossing the mat toward Renee, who was gathering training pads into a storage bin, sweat damp and glowing in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with purpose. "You were incredible," he said. "They were incredible," Renee corrected, though she allowed herself a small smile. "I just gave them the tools. They're the ones who'll actually use them." Nathan watched her for a moment, this woman who'd walked into his life through the side door of a catering entrance and quietly rearranged everything he thought he understood about strength, about dignity, about what it meant to build something worth being proud of. "Can I take you to dinner?" he asked. "Not a foundation dinner. Just dinner." Renee looked at him, and something in her expression, steady, warm, finally, fully unguarded, answered before her words did. "I'd like that," she said. "But I'm choosing the restaurant this time. Somewhere they won't care what I'm wearing when I walk in." Nathan laughed, the sound easy and full in a way it hadn't been in months. "Deal." Nobody who was in that ballroom in July ever forgot the night Bianca Sinclair grabbed a maid's wrist at Nathan Cole's engagement gala, but almost no one who told the story afterward remembered it the way it actually ended. By the following spring, the self-defense program at the Cole Foundation had grown from 22 girls to over 200, spread across 3 locations in Providence and 2 more in neighboring towns, funded not by guilt or damage control but by a genuine partnership between a man who'd learned, in the space of one terrible evening, how much he didn't know about the people around him, and a woman who'd spent 5 years believing the best parts of her life were already behind her. Renee never went back to competitive fighting. She didn't need to. What she'd found instead, hundreds of girls walking taller, speaking louder, carrying themselves through the world with a quiet confidence that no trophy or title had ever given her the same way, meant more to her than any championship belt ever had. Every so often, watching a shy 12-year-old land her first clean release, Renee would think of her own 6-year-old self walking into a dojo for the first time, and she'd feel something settle into place that had been unsettled for a very long time. Her brother, healthy and thriving in Providence, liked to tell people, with the particular pride of a younger sibling who knew exactly what his sister had sacrificed for him, that his sister had once given up a world championship to save his life, and years later, without ever asking for anything back, the world had found a way to give her something even bigger in return. Nathan, for his part, never forgot the lesson that night had taught him, and it changed the way he ran every part of his life afterward. The way he greeted the people who cleaned his office buildings, the way he tipped, the way he looked people in the eye instead of past them. Wealth, he'd come to understand, wasn't dangerous in itself. What was dangerous was the blindness it could create if you let it. The slow, quiet erosion of noticing anyone who couldn't do anything for you. He and Renee married 18 months later, in a small ceremony that looked nothing like the gala where they'd first truly seen each other. No chandeliers, no 300 guests, no photographers deleting evidence of anyone's worst moment. Just close family, her brother giving a toast that made everyone cry, and Nathan, standing at the altar, watching the woman who'd once served him water at his own engagement party walk toward him in a dress she'd chosen herself, exactly the way she wanted, for exactly the life she'd built on her own terms. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The way you treat someone who can't do anything for you is the truest measure of who you really are. Not the version of yourself you show in interviews, or at galas, or in carefully curated moments meant to impress. The real version, the one that comes out in a single unguarded second, when you think no one important is watching. Renee Carter never asked to be seen that night. She would have been perfectly content to keep serving water, clearing plates, and going home to train alone in the quiet of her own discipline, unnoticed, unheralded, exactly as she had for 5 years. But sometimes the world forces a reckoning anyway, not to punish anyone, but to remind everyone in the room, all at once, that dignity doesn't depend on a uniform, and worth was never something anyone else had the right to decide for you in the first place. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to do 3 small things before you go. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because there are so many more stories like Renee's waiting to be told. And if someone in your life needs a reminder that quiet strength always outlasts loud cruelty, send this one their way. Sometimes the smallest share is exactly what someone needed on exactly the right day. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next story.